Anaconda, and tonight on 15 Minutes, we travel back to a period in our nation's history full of change, growth, and political division. We will be covering many important events, including early industrialization, the Second Great Awakening, and conflicts with Native Americans, all of which shaped the America we know today.
Prior to the turn of the century, the ideas of salvation through good deeds and tolerance had an effect on moral movements such as prison reform, the temperance movement, increased roles for women, and slavery. These beliefs and actions were known as the Second Great Awakening and carried out until the 1830s.
At the turn of the century, Thomas Jefferson had become president. He feared banks and large corporations and hoped to keep America as a society of small, independent farmers. His main stress was diminishing the divide between the two parties. He said,
"Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists."
Jefferson had a prejudice against judges. He feared they would realize their power and look for ways of expanding and strengthening it even further.
Prior to Jefferson's election, the Judiciary Act of 1801 was passed, which created 6 new circuit courts and 16 new federal judges. John Adams filled these positions with conservative members of the Federalist Party. These judges were called midnight judges. Adams' appointing of these judges led to Marbury v. Madison, which John Marshall found part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional and established judicial review.
Another unplanned success of Jefferson's presidency was the success of the Louisiana Purchase, which gave the United States crucial access to the Mississippi River and New Orleans. Getting this land protected the U.S. from France and Spain because we acquired all of their North American land.
Sold!
The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibited all American exports in an effort to pressure Britain and France into recognizing America's neutrality while they were at war. This act had catastrophic effects because both exports and imports dropped significantly and many Americans lost jobs and turned to smuggling.
The next major event in our nation's history was the War of 1812. Britain tried to restrict American trade and refused to honor U.S. neutrality while also forcing American seamen into the Royal British Navy. As a result, the Democratic Republicans, led by now President James Madison, encouraged war with Britain in hopes that the invasion in Canada would result in significant land gains. In the end, Americans gained little from the war, and the Treaty of Ghent returned the United States to the conditions it held before the war. The Federalists were against the war efforts, and after the end of the war, the Hartford Convention put a close to the whole Federalist Party.
In 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was established. Then Maryland passed legislation to try to tax the bank, and when an employee refused to pay the tax, the case went to the court in McCulloch v. Maryland. In the end, the court held that Congress had the enumerated powers, and Maryland did not have the right to tax instruments of the national government.
In 1819, the United States had 11 free states and 11 slave states, thus creating a balance in the U.S. Senate. Missouri's entrance in the nation threatened to throw off the balance. In 1820, Henry Clay came up with a solution which would admit Missouri as a slave state, but would also be balanced by Maine, which would be a free state. Second, slavery was to be excluded from all areas of the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern boundary of Mississippi. This became known as the Missouri Compromise.
With the United States now equally balanced, we looked outward and sought to expand the nation. We felt that our involvement with Europe would limit expansion and distract from it, so we created the Monroe Doctrine, which declared that America was no longer open to European colonization or exploitation, and the United States would not interfere with the internal affairs of European nations.
In the 1770s, the British had many developments in production, specifically textiles, but they were sure to keep their methods a secret. When Samuel Slater, an English-born mechanic, came to America and installed machinery in American factories. This revolutionized production, and by 1800, 7 textile mills were in operation. The War of 1812 stimulated production, increasing the number of factories to 216. This increase in production helped the economy grow and provided jobs for many Americans, specifically young girls. The Erie Canal, created in 1825, helped with transportation and greatly benefited New York, while also establishing a place for factory towns along its route. The population of the United States also more than doubled as immigration grew.
In 1824, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but still lost after the House of Representatives elected John Quincy Adams as president. In 1828, he ran again, this time successfully winning the presidency. Jackson became a symbol for a new democratically oriented generation. His past as a war hero showed his patriotism, and he epitomized many American ideals. It was these traits that drew him support from every social class of American voters. Jackson also rejuvenated the Democratic Party, thus making America a two-party system again.
He conceived of himself as the direct representation and embodiment of national power. This is evident through his overuse of the presidential power of veto. Jackson was suspicious of the credit system and banks in general, after his personal experiences, and Jackson was determined to destroy the second bank of the United States. He is quoted saying,
"The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it."
Another aspect of Jackson's presidency was continuous strife with Native Americans. In 1930, the Indian Removal Act was passed by Jackson, and this authorized him the power to grant unsettled lands in the West to the Native Americans in exchange for their lands within the existing state borders. Many of the Native American tribes resisted relocation and felt they were being pushed out of lands their families had held for generations.
In the case of the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, the Cherokee tribe wanted to maintain their land in Georgia, but the state refused to recognize them as a nation. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled the Cherokee were not a foreign state in the Constitution and therefore couldn't sue in U.S. court.
Elected president in 1836, Martin Van Buren kept many of the Jacksonian ideals alive. He worked closely under Jackson, and this caused him to continue to denounce the American system and oppose the Whigs.
From 1837 to 1838, 15,000 Cherokees were forced to leave Georgia for Oklahoma.
Get out.
Previous President Jackson had strongly backed Georgia's position in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, in that no independent nation could exist within the U.S. In the 1832 case Worcester v. Georgia, it was stated that Georgia couldn't control the Cherokee or their territory. However, Jackson allowed the state to ignore the Supreme Court decision and perpetuated the Trail of Tears. On the Trail of Tears, at least 4,000 Native Americans died of starvation, disease, and exposure.
Finally, in 1840, William Henry Harrison is elected president. A former member of the Democratic Party, he now defined himself as a Whig. The idea of the Log Cabin Campaign came into popularity and convinced Americans that any person can rise to power in the American government. Even though Harrison was from a distinguished family, was well educated, and from a wealthy background, he implemented this campaign and gave him a huge success as he won by a large margin. Unlike Jackson, Harrison had no ambition to be an aggressive leader. He felt Jackson had misused presidential power in vetoing and professed to put emphasis on separation of executive and legislative branch powers.
As you can see, the early 1800s was a time of change and development in our nation. Thank you for watching this edition of 15 Minutes. I'm Anaconda. Good night, America.